welcome everybody to the second of our 8 artist talks that are organised between the University of Worcester and Meadow Arts. Our first talk was Rupi Dillon, who we're hoping is going to arrive into the group soon. But today it's Hamja Ahsan, who I'll be introducing in a little while. So this is now the Art House Open Lecture Talks, are now into their 6th season. And as I say, we had Rupi Dillon was our first speaker. And today we have Hamja. And just a quick shout out for who's coming next. We have Juno Projects on the 1st of February, Andy Holden on the 8th of February, Jack Evans on the 22nd of Feb, Deanne Crooks on the 8th of March, Spur, which is Joey Holder and Megan Broadmeadow on the 12th of April, and finally, I think Vanley Burke on the 19th. So they can check all that out on the Meadow Arts website, and all the information is there. All the talks are recorded and will be uploaded when they're edited onto the Meadow Arts website. And I just want to thank Leanne and Rebecca, who are here, for setting up this session with Hamja. So just a brief bio of Hamja. Hamja is an artist, writer, and activist and curator based in London and Maastricht. He's the author of the book Shy Radicals, Antisystemic Politics of the Militant Introvert, recently made into a documentary film by Ridley Scott Associates. He was recently awarded the prestigious Grand Prize at Ljubljana Biennial in 2019 for the artwork of Aspergistan Referendum, based on the Shy Radicals project. He is founder and co-curator of the DIY Cultures Festival of Creative Activism, Zines and Independent Publishing since 2013. He was shortlisted for the Liberty Human Rights Award for Free Talha Ahsan campaign on extradition and detention without trial under the War on Terror. His recent writing was anthologized in No Color Bar, Black Art in Action, 1960 to 1990. He has presented art projects at PS1 MoMA, New York Art Book Week, Tate Modern, Gwangju Biennale, Sharnact Festival Pakistan, and CCA Warsaw, Poland. His practice encompasses all media, conceptual writing, building archives, performance videos, sound and making zines. He is currently, as he explained, resident artist at the Jan van Eyck Academy in the Netherlands. He's also on the editorial board for the radical mental health magazine Asylum. And just to say, please do purchase a copy of Hamja's book. It's absolutely brilliant. And do so, if possible, through Bookworks, directly from the Bookworks website. Bookworks is the most important British artist book publisher, and do it that way if you can, please. So a little bit of housekeeping rules. Just keep your mics on mute. They're automatically set to mute, but you may accidentally turn them off mute. So make sure they're on. Hamja's going to give about a 30-minute talk that will be followed by a discussion between me and Hamja, kind of quite free form. And then there'll be 10 minutes or so for questions. Leanne will be gathering the questions from the chat. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, and Leanne will pass them on. And I think that's everything that you need to know for now. Have I missed anything, Leanne or Rebecca? Okay, great. So without further ado, please welcome Hamja Ahsan.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I would have liked to be here in person. I'm actually trapped here in the Netherlands. I can't actually go home due to the super infectious corona strain. As homesick as I am. So I'd like to start the talk in a new room that opened in Tate Modern, which is the Quiet Room in Tate Modern, Tate Britain. And recently the Tate collection of galleries has been recognised in this other form of thinking about accessibility and inclusion, which is the Quiet Room. And in relation to the previous talk in the series by Rupi Dillon, which I recommend you watch in the archive, also thinking about types of identity which aren't surveyable but may carry strong forms of identification. So I've always related to quiet people who like libraries and gallery space, and it's a particular space where you can experience a particular type of contemplative silence. And whilst I identify as an introvert and a shy, quiet, awkward person, I would, how does it relate universally to concepts of like health or like rest or recovery? I mean, how does it benefit all of us to recognize these spaces? And what's the meaning of it, like, just as a room? Imagine the whole world could be a quiet room, or your high street, or the city. I'm someone who's lived in busy cities most of my life, so I'm a born and bred Londoner. Currently, most of my practice grows out of a book I wrote in 2017, 3 years ago, and thinking about forms of demographic exclusion and alienation. The primary way I experienced bullying within education and secondary school and primary school was for being quiet and shy, and not necessarily having a liberation movement or trajectory or group. So if I was discriminated on the basis of gender, I could always refer to the sort of suffragettes and the feminist movement, or class, the trade union movement, or race, the decoloniality movements and civil rights struggle. So I didn't really have anything as a quiet, shy, awkward person, so I just made one up. The poet Sam Rivera calls what I do speculative activism, which is a really handy phrase. I see myself as the Black Panthers of the introvert class. And my mission in life is to overthrow extrovert supremacy. Sometimes I don't even introduce myself as an artist or writer, but I just say I'm the commander-in-chief of the global revolutionary movement called Shy Radicals, and I'm on a never-ending world tour to overthrow the oppressive ideology of extrovert supremacy, and I won't stop until that ideology is overthrown. And here I am at Meadow Arts. My brother was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, my older brother, and as a result I read a lot of peer-led literature which I identified and relate to. This is Asperger's United, which was a peer-edited and peer-read autism spectrum magazine. I think it's been discontinued, but it took the form of like a zine or a very DIY publication. And there were certain things you would read in these publications, such as how, say, an awkward experience in a corridor might make you ruin your day, or things about eye contact, and things you just wouldn't find in, say, the mainstream media or standard like men or women's lifestyle magazine. So I drew upon that and drew extra attentiveness to that. Also reading the life writing of autism spectrum, there was this comorbidity with depression and also suicidal ideation. And there was one phrase which stuck in a book about autism depression, was the autism spectrum as second-class citizens. So I thought, how can you take this literally? Like, how could you therefore transform citizenship? And how does like the standard processes of democracy or the media or the state or the nation reinforce forms of exclusion for this coalition of quiet, awkward people? So I made up this nation-state homeland called Aspergistan, and it's influenced by lots of different utopic constitutions, and also lots of constitutions for like current separatist struggles. So I read the Kurdistan draft constitution, I read the Soviet Union constitution, the beautiful Cuban constitution, which is very poetic, and I sort of developed a sort of poetics of law. And my other attitude is that when we think of fiction, like we could take the idea that everything is fiction or a potential format for fiction. So everything from the Facebook event for this event to like a bus schedule to like a menu. So one piece of writing that we're all subject to is like the law as well. And I think I'm from one of those aspirational Asian families where my mum would have preferred me to be a lawyer, but and then I realised late in life, law is like this big piece of conceptual art, but real life. So I developed this nation, which will be the sanctuary, beacon, and homeland of oppressed, quiet, and autistic spectrum peoples, and imagined what sort of geographies and sort of institutions of democracy would change. So the book's written in multiple formats. The way in which we exchange politics is generally through like 500-word opinion pieces or blogs for The Guardian written in plain prose. And, why do we stick to these formats? I find satire and things like oral history and maybe music writing has all sorts of other formats. And, also thinking about how we think of like medical writing or public services from the Samaritans. I drew on all these things, often dealing with like minority or public services, and developed my book. So that I've returned back to this concept of neurodiversity. So while the book is a work of fiction, it's been integrated into actual real life movement. So the neurodiversity, which is led by autistic spectrum peoples, takes a lot of inspiration, I guess, from LGBTQI liberation movements. And homosexuality was in the psychiatric manual, I think, until like 1976, and then only taken out by very actual, not a huge margin. I think it was like 60% of the American Psychiatric Association. So instead of thinking of, say, Asperger's syndrome as a disorder or something to be corrected or a deficiency or something to be cured, employing the sort of social model of mental health. So seeing it as simply a different sensibility or another way of being or another language or another way of experiencing senses. And while it's led by autism spectrum peoples, it also includes people who might have dyspraxia and maybe affective disorders like bipolar, and really thinking about how the architecture we live in is very much conditioned by these things. There's this phrase neurotypical, which is peer led, and one of the ways in which the book and work is distributed is via the long table format. You can see a image of a long table here, and the long table is a format in experimental theatre, developed by a performance artist called Louise Weaver. The figure I've mentioned here, Daniel Oliver, is very important for me, and it's sort of I regard him as an unofficial gang leader of the neurodiversity movement in the arts. He runs a mental health MA, mental health and arts MA at Queen Mary. I always think of forms of alliance. So he has dyspraxia and calls his art practice dyspraxis, and thought of alliances between Dyspraxistan and Aspergistan. But I highly recommend you get this book called Awkwards by the Live Art Development Agency, which I've written a chapter from about neurodivergent revolution. There's also this wonderful guide by the Live Art Development Agency, which he's compiled, which will give you a wider introduction, which you can just download the website and go on YouTube. And I've done this thing called Why Daniel Oliver is an Important Artist. But one of the ways we've worked together is through this long table format, which anyone can sit at the table. There's no conclusion, no end. You can write on the table, and it was a form of public address system by the feminist performance artist Louise Weaver, and so we've readapted it for neurodiversity. So, but imagine it wasn't a form of theatre. Imagine this is what we did instead of like having a coffee or going to the pub, or even if instead of debating in Parliament, we did decisions like that. What would it open up? Also thinking about accessibility, this is a pack you get at the Autism Arts Festival, which is a festival I've taken part in, which is a biennale in Kent. And here you have these signs, which green says, I'm happy to talk, but struggle to initiate conversation. Red, I don't want to talk to anyone. Yellow, I only want to talk to people I know. And stickers for hugs or photographs or ability to block out noise. There's also fidget spinners in this pack. So even neurotypical females said they'd like something like this to avoid like harassment. So I think if you did have like institutional equality and recognition, how would you help others? The etiquette for the long table can also something you can download. I'd highly recommend. Yeah. So we've talked earlier about the writing I do, a lot of which is related to law. So I've written a series of laws in the opening chapter, or fictional laws. To give you a simple example, Article 17, introversion is inviolable. No person may disturb its peace or violate its freedom. The state shall guarantee freedom from small talk, freedom from coercive visual distraction, freedom from enforced jollity or coerced happiness, freedom from extrovert harassment during leisure time and national holidays, the right to stay in one's home during leisure time and national holidays, free from superficial judgment on outward appearance and consumer choices, freedom from frivolous public media assaults, freedom from stigmatization for the pursuit of introvert life, freedom from extrovert epistemic violence or accusation of being antisocial or aloof. Disrupting the concentration of Aspergistan citizens will be taken seriously and punished in full accordance with the law. So thinking about existing human rights legislation, I'd just like to draw attention to this case that I often talk about. So Sophie Lancaster was someone murdered for being a goth, and her family campaign still, because they see that hate crime for being a goth wasn't necessarily recognised within legislation. And I think there's something within that, and also the forms of bullying and discrimination as introversion not being recognised, that has some sort of overlap. And also the scapegoating. But there's a wonderful film called Killed for Being Different, I recommend. But imagine you could have, like, say, a trade union case based on discrimination for being quiet. So I often observe some of the poses and body language we use in terms of power. So you often get these assertiveness guides, and this is like a Wonder Woman guide. And then there's other forms of communication which might embody contentment or discontentment, such as curling into a ball, or staring at the sky, or staring into space, or staring into the floor. And how do they embody political gestures too? So as part of the book, I've also integrated some of these gestures. So the work which was mentioned earlier, which is the Aspergistan Referendum, so Slavs and Tartars, who were the curators that invited me to adapt the book for the Ljubljana Biennial. So all across the city, people could take part in this referendum. And it was interesting because Slovenia was the first country to separate from Yugoslavia via independence referendum. So it's very much influenced by contemporary history. I actually ended up winning the referendum by a landslide margin. So I adapted it as that, and then we also readapted it to Warsaw, where the Biennale travelled, and the whole book was reread in the COVID crisis. There's a wonderful article in Freeze called "Why COVID-19 Might Be Our Chance to Reimagine the Arts," which I recommend you all read, and Century references the book. And we actually won the referendum in Warsaw by 80%, so one election that went well this year. So, for example, this is one of the articles of law. Aspergistan shall adopt its own internal measurements of distance to ensure the safeguarding of empty space. And so it's often called like lockdown reading. There are a lot of tweets and social media cultures about introverts saving the world, and often a lot of selfish sort of rave parties during this period too. And there's often a lot of the fan letters I get from Italy at the height of the crisis and stuff. So in the past, I used to curate, edit, commission, blah, blah, blah. These days, I actually don't do any of these activities, but through endlessly touring Show Radicals, I've been touring for 3.5 years, I think across 9 different countries, from Slovenia, America, Norway. It's produced its own trail of works inspired directly by the concepts in the book. and it's also been on a lot of curriculums as well. This is just a small sample of them, from radio shows, conceptual radio shows, to this book about the autistic turn, which reuses some of the vocabulary in the book. So terms that I've been mentioning, like extrovert supremacy or Aspergistan Introvert, has been sort of living a life beyond the book. Just recently in Belgium, there's this series of robots. I think they're robots. I've just been recently made aware of this work, which have been going around the city. I think they're meant to be big ears, but the texts that these robots do are directly inspired by the text of the book. And there were also other forms of collectives. So there's a collective called Academics Against Networking in Manchester, which is directly inspired by the book, which is directly about academics who don't like networking. And also there's plans of making other, like a city-based series, so people in New York City, which is hyperstimulation, thinking about how to reread those cities. There's also people in like Beijing and other big cities. So the book has been recently made into film. You can look up the trailers on YouTube, and it's currently touring film festivals. And I sort of redesigned the sort of costume and soundtrack and elements of the film. So part of my practice is also just develop gestures. So as an activist, I was involved in a lot of these movements, like movements for racial equality, or like this was Occupy, and there was all these gestures like jazz hands, waving your hands about, or throwing your fist in the air and things like that. And I sometimes actually felt just as alienated within these contexts, which is supposedly about inequality. So these are some of the gestures I made up, and the relation to aspirational capital. So you could actually look up hashtag Shy Power Salute and add to it if you like on Instagram. So it's a bit fist curled in front of your mouth and a bit like a cough, and partly just inventing that gesture I consider part of my practice, and it's sort of gone internationally. So what you see on the left is a Zoom call from Ljubljana, the Ule Foundation, and also shots in the Philippines and the rest of the world. So I think it's like inventing my own street language, and the sort of signal of shy power is also spread to other countries. So the Italian edition of the book's called Intrafada, the translation. So someone actually recently tattooed the shy power symbol to their arm, and it sort of spread that way too. And there's also been international rereadings of this movement in the book and integrated into other sort of movements. So there's the movement against Bolsonaro, the sort of neo-fascist, neoliberal, populist, hard-right leader of Brazil, and people who have also integrated it into these sort of other movements that I'm not aware of. The book also has roots in some of my early practice. So I did a project called Redo Pakistan. I'm actually from a Bangladeshi / Indian Bengali background, and we invited writers and artists to reimagine the troubled nation of Pakistan. But it's the first time I'm thinking about nations and states and how to redo them. Also coming from a country like Bangladesh, which has only been around since 1971, or being in a country like Slovenia, which has only been around since 1991, it's very transparent how nations invent themselves, or the icons they used and so forth. So part of my practice as a writer and a curator and an activist or whatever is just to make up words and my own critical vocabulary, which I've been doing for like the last decade. So things like Islamic extreme unicism, developmentia, which is a cross between development, dementia, and bureautics, misvert, so don't call me an extrovert. And I think a lot of theory is, and someone outside academia for the last 11 years has become too professionalized and orthodox and formalized. So I think there's a lot of critical play in like slang and play and puns and things like that. So it's something I employ. I'd also recommend academically looking at the work of Susie Scott, who implies Foucault's notions of deviance to the notion of shyness, and she's someone I've spoken with on the tours and has influenced the book a lot. I'm also involved in the revival of zine culture. In the last 10 years, there's been a huge revival of zine culture, despite online and social media. And this is a big festival I do called DIY Cultures, which I've done for 5 years. I mean, New York Art Book Fair at PS1 is like 50% zines. So when COVID's over, we'll be back doing zine culture. And there's also a whole zine culture around Asperger's syndrome and something I distribute. And also a zine culture around medicine and disability. So there's zines called FU, I'm dyslexic, or Don't effing look at me, thanks. But I guess they're against the sort of charity model or like NGO or like respectability politics. So taking that punk attitude towards politics. And Shape Arts Collection, which is a very progressive mental health charity, has a huge archive of that. I'm also just currently, I've been collecting zines for 25 years, or since 94, so even longer than that, 27 years. So if you go to DIY Zine Bank, you can see some of this collection. And it's a nomadic library that I travel with and develop projects and curriculum with. Icarus Group are one of my favourite radical mental health groups, a group of bipolar people in New York, but how to sort of reclaim a suicidal episode. So it says by having these episodes, you also reject your job pretenses, society standards, and therefore claim the whole thing. But things that aren't marketable and aren't like appealable to like employability. And I'm also on this radical mental health magazine for the last year called Asylum, which is a permanent open call. So everyone here who's interested in this way of really thinking beyond pathology can contribute. Just Google us. And parts of the book become real life. So one of the chapters in the book includes a public helpline, so dial 001, where you can escape extrovert supremacy and like a public service or Samaritan service. And so we sort of recreated this line, so you can actually dial this number and be part of this. But it was also used as a compositional method for the film. So people rang in this line and could be part of the dialogue in the film and the sort of scenes in it. And we also did an extrovert emergency helpline recently because extroverts couldn't cope with the current lockdown conditions. I'm actually going to show you a bit of it. I know I'm running out of time, but
Extrovert Emergency Rescue Hotline. Extrovert in a crisis? Struggling with life in lockdown? Shy Radicals and the Introvert Alliance offer aid and support during this global pandemic. Please leave your messages of personal distress from quarantine on the Extrovert Emergency Hotline. The Shy People's Republic of Aspergistan is listening. Please call the number below to participate. +44 07984.
Okay. So it's done in the context in which there's a whole sort of cottage industry around introvert publishing, probably the biggest thing being Susan Cain's Quiet, who I regard as the Tony Blair of introverts. And there's also World Introvert Day on 2nd of July. So thinking about how we can employ these things. But there's a whole twee sort of industry around introversion. But I think my attitude's about militancy and systematic reform and protection. I think before I wrote the book, Greta Thunberg wasn't a big public figure, but I think she embodies many of the ideals. People say, oh, by speaking in public, aren't you selling out? But it shows how you can embody the public realm and the public sphere whilst maintaining your unassimilated Asperger's. And I find something heroic in her going on mainstream chat shows and not making eye contact. But there's a whole part of the practice of the book is also delving into the history. So I look at people like Patrick Pearse, who's the head of the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916, or Clement Attlee, who introduced the welfare state, or Gareth Peirce, the radical human rights lawyer, and how they also embody forms of radical practice whilst being quite shy and awkward. And it also comes in the time of a revival of speculative fiction for minorities, the biggest example being the Black Panther movie, but also the rival Octavia Butler. So I see the book as part of that vein. Current project I'm working at the moment is called the 2772. So I'm very interested in the 27 Club, which is referenced in the book, but also how people like Kurt Cobain's suicide was a big thing for me, the biggest cultural event for me, and why people like Iggy Pop are still alive. So that's a work in process, but do join the 27 Club on Facebook if you'd like to keep up with it. And I'm also including people like Bobby Sands, because I as part of the 27 Club, and how I could rewrite that. And that's the work I'm developing at the moment. Thank you.
You've got 5 more minutes if you want it.
I have 5 more minutes. I was really...
Yeah.
Let me just read a little bit from the book, I guess. Okay. The world will not sing in perfect harmony. Nothing will be solved by extrovert people simply being all right. How are you? How was your weekend? And other small talk, microaggressions, will not be registered as real concerns anymore until restitution. A blacklist of public spaces service staff have told our people to cheer up will be drawn up in cooperation with the enemy. There's cafes where we wished only to sit alone with black coffee and the company of a good book. What else you imagine a cafe is for? To establish profit and economic growth? We will seize every buck of every glassy cafe, and with that, every chain bar, chain pub. We will return cafes to the original asocial social function for our people. Do not dare impose your feel-good ideology on us ever again. That's from the final chapter, which is a chapter on reparations. I've got 2 minutes left. I think I'll just show the film trailer, actually.
When you were here before, couldn't look you in the eye. You're just like an angel.
When I listen to that song, it really makes me feel like I'm part of something larger.
It's just a song that seems so universal, and I have no idea how many teenagers who are like in pain have listened to that song. You don't feel as lonely, you don't feel like an island in your suffering. You're kind of part of something bigger.
But I'm a creep.
But the fact that we're still singing this song makes me feel like the world's not a better place. And I thought, like, if we all got together, or we performed some sort of movement together, we could make the world a better place and use that song to connect all of us.
And that's something that I really resonate with. That's a goal and a project that I'd really want to be part of.
You should join the Shy Resistance movement then.
I'd love to.
I want you to notice when I'm not around. You're so fucking special. I wish I was special, but I'm a creep. I'm a widow. What the hell am I doing here? I don't belong here. I don't belong here.
Thank you so much for that. There's so much to take in. You've been doing so much work. It's kind of overwhelming in a way, everything that you've done and what's been happening since, Shy Radicals was published.
Yeah.
But so maybe let's just go straight in to questions that I have directly. Now, currently the issue around art and mental health is super amplified because of COVID and because of lockdown. I just wonder, if you could say something about what you've been doing and how it's, how lockdown has affected perhaps the way people have been communicating with you or reading shy radicals? What if you could just say something about that?
I guess reading it as a sort of avant-garde sort of manifesto, but I mean, there's some inadequacy that people can't deal with being in alone or being inside for so long, and so instead of really thinking about how we teach people like assertiveness skills or select employment on outgoing personality, and I've even been employed as a invigilator where you sit in silence in the gallery, and it's almost like who can be the greater cheerleader when it gets the job. So reversing that order and thinking of us as like we should be the ones teaching them. Yeah. And what constitutes healthy behaviour? And so I'm someone who's been pathologized, or for simply wanting to be quiet and having that ability, and being absorbed in things. So turning hierarchies on their head. But I also think it just reveals the sort of egotism and selfishness of extrovert supremacy. Extrovert supremacy kills. Like here in the Netherlands and in Slovenia, there's lots of illegal parties, and in Britain as well. So rethinking the way we think about liberation and freedom as well.
Great, thank you very much. I have another question around the difference between social media and making fanzines, and really, it's great the work you've done with fanzine, and particularly neurodiverse and mental health fanzines. I just wanted to say if you could say something about the benefits of the fanzine, like handmade, DIY published over or relative to social media.
There's something about slowness and tactility, but as long as with the revival of the actual media form is also the revival of zine fairs. So I think just face-to-face contact. There's a certain type of sort of grandiosity that occurs in either big institutions, very pretentious, curatorial language. So bringing things back to sort of small-scale company is good too. Just the value of friendship and also the value of informality. I think there's also something in like the cruelty of social media and its anonymity or its snap judgment or its instantaneity, which is sort of, and there's multiple books of that, like Richard Seymour's Twittering Machine. I think a bit the book Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel. So I think of it as a resistance from mode outside of that. There's also the way in which zine culture has been integrated into larger structures. So Artists Union England, which is the national trade union for artists, do a fanzine. I think there's something about the excessive bureaucracy which rules all our lives, excessive administration which rules all our lives. I'm quite a big fan of Ivan Illich, the Catholic anarchist thinker who wrote Deschooling Society, which you can download, and Tools for Conviviality. So it reintroduces conviviality into structures which may be too bureaucratized, and that's essentially what happens within mass movements. What happens in mass movements is you become instrumentalized or used, and bring in the joy of like play and laziness and the doodle and the idle thought, and recognizing those as of equal value too. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. I'll just ask one more question, and then I will open it up to anybody from the chat, or perhaps if somebody wants to ask a direct question, that's fine too, I assume. Is that okay? So it's just, this is, at Worcester we have a fine art with psychology degree, and there's a lot of discussion about mental health and well-being and art therapy. And we touched on this earlier. It seems to me that there's a tradition within art which is kind of anti-psychiatric, which is a resistance to the categories, to the pathologization of sexuality and gender, etc. I wonder where do you see yourself as coming from an anti-psychiatry perspective?
I mean, the anti-psychiatry movement has its pitfalls and mistakes, and just like some of the, like with any other sort of 60s radicalism and excesses, and like I wouldn't want to be irresponsible and tell people to stop taking their prescription or something like that. But certainly, firstly, that R.D. Laing has had a huge influence both in terms of what was the Turner Prize winner got? IQ. I think he was nominated, but he did a film. But it's still very influential in Cafe Otto, which is a arts cafe. There's whole events around Artie Lang, so he still has this influence within the art world. And also his format of writing in like Knots and The Divided Self were quite big influence. So I also did a talk about Lang at which you can Google when it's a big influence in Asylum. Yeah, but I mean, my first point of like engaging with psychiatry critically wasn't necessarily as intellectual as anti-psychiatry movement. So I think I was interested in like the Manic Street Preachers and Kurt Cobain, and that was the first time in which I identified these sort of sensitive white male angsty musicians, and they were talking very publicly about their symptoms and their experiences and through their songwriting. So that was and the fanzine culture around that period in the early 90s is how I got into zines. So that was the first way in which I engaged in a way which wasn't bureaucratic clinical psychiatry. Psychiatry is also this a particular form of knowledge, which is sort of a psychiatrist knows you better than you know yourself, which sort of I reject in my book. And that's why I go to these peer sources. But also in terms of the touring of the book, so I've toured the book with Dolly Sen, who I recommend everyone look up, who did this thing called DSM 69, which is like a satire of the diagnostic manual. Brilliant book. But I've also circulated the book. There's a wonderful gallery called Bedlam Gallery, and it's situated right in the heart of Bedlam Asylum, which is actually the world's oldest psychiatric hospital. So I recommend everybody Google that place. But the exhibitions they do there really critically reflect and openly with these sort of forms of like the sort of oppressive aspects of psychiatry. But I also think some of the ethos of the zine culture is to be against corporate ownership. So big pharma, which is unaccountable, and also like state structures like over bureaucratized welfare states, and things like that. So the book's also circulated within that gallery and within exhibitions within that gallery. I've also worked with the performance artist Oriana Fox, who does this wonderful thing called the O Show, which is like an Oprah Winfrey parody. The O Show is about confessing like mental health experiences. So I've spoken on that. That's actually one of my favourite interviews, which you can find online. I'm sure we'll send out the links. So all those things are like, fellow travellers. There's the biggest influence of the book was actually a book called by the Socialist Patients Collective, and they wrote a book called Use Illness as Your Weapon, which is again part of the 1960s and the Baader-Meinhof gang, and Jean-Paul Sartre was a champion of them. But the writing formats they did, so they got things like the Viet Cong and used that as metaphors for group psychotherapy. But as a piece of writing, it's just incredible, and the format of the book is directly influenced by that book. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Hamja. That's brilliant. So, Leanne, do we have some questions?
Yes, we do. So we've got 3 questions. We've got one from Juliet, which is kind of like a two-faced one, which I'm going to start off with, if that's all right, Hamja. So Juliet asks, have you found that COVID has helped shy radicals? And do you think that time in solitude for so many will offer more understanding?
Yeah, time in solitude is great to start with the reverse, but there's no institutional encouragement. So, for example, here at Jan van Eyck Academy, we have group dinners or informal rave parties or whatever, which I don't either allow me space in or there's no way of like institutionally encouraging solitude or small company. So I set up this thing called Crayon Club, where I just make big crayon drawings of 3 other people, and that was my informal way of dealing with that structure. On one hand, there's a whole new body of articles and writing around the book due to COVID, and it's called under hashtag lockdown reading, and whole new empathy with it. But on the other hand, literary festivals have been shut down. My 4 trips abroad this year, which was to Norway, Poland, and to tour the book in Italy, in Switzerland were all shut down as well. All bookshops are shut down. That's why I'm begging people to support Bookworks as a publisher and buy it directly from there and look at their brilliant range. So that hasn't helped anyone. And everything's in crisis and uncertainty in the entire world. So I don't know what, even this Biennale that I'm preparing for, I have no idea whether it'll actually happen. My residency was cancelled 4 times. So
sorry, I'm
those
just
things don't-
now.
Yeah, and yeah. So that hasn't helped like anyone.
Okay,
Yeah.
no worries. So we've got a second question from Stefan, and they ask, do you find Zoom easier or harder to connect with people?
I think I've just been zoomed out. I think that term Zoom bees. Sometimes when I was in London stuck in, I was just too much time staring at screens. And there's now the traffic jam, nearly 1 year into the pandemic of Zoom meetings has just become too much. So I do experience fatigue and exhaustion and on the other hand, I've stayed directly connected to movements in London without being divorced. I was living in the Netherlands, so that's been nice as well.
Okay, no worries. We've just got another one that's come in. Do you believe fiction has the power to act as a catalyst for change in reality?
Definitely, but also in terms of national myths. I like the Irish socialists. I like James Connolly and I like Patrick Pearse and I like the Irish nationalist take on leftism because it wasn't directly materialistic. It relied on things like mysticism or legends or things like that. But I think all history is to some extent a fiction, and I'm someone who's I was born in the 80s, so I have no idea what it was like to have the Soviet Union or those utopic projects. But so to me that's all one big sci-fi epic. It's like the history of communism to me is like the history Game of Thrones or something like that. There's also wonderful work about science fiction and its use in marginalised movements, which I've mentioned. There's a wonderful book called Octavia's Brood, which is about that too. I also think in terms of neurodiversity, we always know forms of, I know Star Trek, to use an obvious example, is a gathering for people with autism, or is a way of creating group identifications as well. I mean, it can also be misused. I don't think the genocides in Bosnia, which of Muslims in Bosnia in the 90s, which struck me, would have happened without all these Serbian grand myths around nationalism. So I think all nations narrate themselves, and it's sort of mythical to some degree as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just going to quickly check the chat, but if anybody else in the meantime, whilst I'm just checking, would like to ask Hamja a question, please pop it in there. I know we've got about 5 minutes left. So yeah, I think that's all the questions. I'm going to give you all 2 minutes to act on that. Maybe wanting to type something in. But I think, did I just see a hand go up?
Yeah, I had a question actually.
Okay.
So Hamja, I just wondered because a friend of mine has a son who's autistic, and she said that some of the things that have happened during lockdown have actually helped him because people don't come too close to him and he doesn't have to see lots of people. And I just wondered if there's some of that you think could be taken forward into, well, we keep calling it normal life, but whatever will happen afterwards.
Yeah, there is something. There are new forms of recognition and reversing hierarchies that happen, and maybe we should institutionally gather all these things together. I do empathise with that.
Great. So if there's no more questions, shall we wrap this up? Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, just thank you so much, Hamja. It's been absolutely amazing. And good luck in Maastricht.
Thank you.
And maybe when lockdown is over, you can come and do the fanzine workshop.
I'd just like to say one last thing, which is if my entire talk made no sense to you, you should go home and check your extrovert privilege.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hamja. We can hang around a while if you like, just to
Definitely.
say goodbye after everyone's gone.
But check out all those links, Asylum magazine, and I left my @ShyRadicals. If you'd like to contact me, I'm very happy and generous with readers and people with curiosity. And there's also @ShyRadicals Film if you'd like to see. The film is touring in film festivals, but at some point it will be in some British film festival again. If you'd like to keep in touch with that. And @2772 Project is the 27 Book Club to join, and if you're a fan of any of the 27 Club. I'm always looking to hear experiences, and I think we're stronger together. Like I don't think we'll ever like there's now. I mean, when I talked to you last, John, which was like 3 years ago, like it's had such a global. There's vlogs in like Mexico City to Hong Kong now, and so there's this sort of identity which transcends national borders, generations, sexual orientation, demographics, which just connects us all in one transnational movement.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you,
Hamja, as well. I don't know if people want to put like applause emojis in the chat or just thank you. I know we don't want to make too much noise. But yeah, this has been wonderful. And if you'd enjoyed today, we're back next week and we're talking to Juno Projects, which I said I'm taking on John's role next week. So we'll be talking to Juno Projects in a Q&A format, and then you can ask questions as well. So I hope everybody has a gorgeous evening. Thank you, Hamja, and stay safe.